Division or analysis. Chopping it up. So what is it? It's the fundamental method that underlies all others. So no matter what you do, if you want to have an opinion, you have to perform some analysis. Now, of course, some analysis is better than others, and we're going to talk about how to decide if your analysis is good. But it is essential to critical thought in scientific inquiry. So whenever they have a problem in the world of science, right, it requires some analysis. You have to look at what the problem is, you have to break it down into its component parts, and then you have to be able to synthesize some sort of solution or some sort of hypothesis relative to that. So with analysis, basically you can comprehend and communicate the structure of things. Like once again, to go back to the science analogy or the science example, all things in science required some sort of analysis before these things were known. If I wanted to think about plate tectonics and how plate tectonics affects earthquakes or brings about earthquakes, right? I had to do a bunch of analysis. I had to do a bunch of experimentation. I had to think about it. I had to break it into its component parts, why things happened, and then come up with a hypothesis relative to that. So there are a lot of kinds of division or analysis. It depends on the context, obviously. It can be more or less difficult depending on the nature of the subject. An example would be an analysis of the part of a carburetor, which is pretty straightforward, versus the analysis of the economic impact of a business on the state's economy. Obviously, in the first example, it doesn't take a whole lot of research, and frankly speaking, it doesn't take a whole lot of persuasion to analyze the parts of a carburetor. Here they are, here's how they work, pretty straightforward. If I analyze the economic impact of a business on the state's economy, well, that's something else. There's a lot more information out there. It requires a lot more analysis of a lot more different factors. And a person has to put a lot more effort to make a compelling argument about why something impacts or why a business impacts the economy one way or the other. Analysis can be even more abstract. One example I can think from a personal example is like literary theory. So you talk about literature and how it affects people psychologically, or how authors use psychological methods, to impart certain ideas to the reader, that sort of thing. So analysis it covers a lot of ground. Relative to critical thinking, if you'll remember critical thinking, or if you are not aware, critical thinking is one of the four core abilities here at CBTC. And analysis obviously plays a fundamental role in critical thinking. If you critically think or read, you divide a subject into its elements and then you synthesize into a new whole that is informed by your perspective. In other words, and really in the simplest terms, is analysis is trying to figure out what to believe. And so it's very important, regardless of the level of kind of thinking that you're doing, to analyze things and analyze things in a scientific way, in a way that, where you show evidence for your beliefs. So if I were to analyze, say, the impact of farming on a riparian zone is the area around a stream, there are a lot of factors that go into that. And I may have biases, up front. Obviously, as you already heard, I'm a trout fisherman. I'm into ecosystems and that sort of thing. And so I might have some biases, though those biases, frankly, are balanced because I know a lot of farmers and a lot of farmers around here, and we need farming, obviously, for food. And so you have to think about those things and analyze it in a way that is basically emotionally detached. In other words, I can't let my bias for the fact that I like trout fishing, or my bias for the fact that one of my best friends is a farmer, influence me one way or the other. I want to analyze the situation, find out what the facts are, and then speak to those facts in a compelling way. Almost anything can be the subject for analysis, of course. This PowerPoint could be the subject for analysis, YouTube, internet classes, whatever. The trick is to make your analysis somehow interesting to the reader. And so, do I care about how a male deer lives his life? If you make me care, I will. So some audiences obviously are easier to convince something's interesting, than others. For example, in the example I just gave, if I'm writing to a bunch of hunters, well, yeah, they care. If I'm writing to a bunch of non-hunters, I have to make them see why it's important. Um, Asking the right questions, knowing your subject matter well, those are extremely important for establishing your paper's purpose. So, a couple things I'd say about writing an analysis paper. The first is find some angle that is interesting to you, and this is always the case in writing. So, find some way to make it interesting to you so you can make it interesting to your reader. If I analyze it, am I analyzing it in a new way or an interesting way? The other thing that I would say, and once again, this is always the case, but particularly important in an analysis paper, you have to know your subject matter well. If your analysis is shoddy, if your evidence is bad or there are arguments against it, then your paper loses a great deal of its power. So what you want to do is, I know what I'm talking about, and I have analyzed it in an interesting way or a way that is compelling, and then I am able to transfer those ideas to the reader. Talk a little bit about evidence, and evidence is very important, obviously, with analysis. First, you need a definitive thesis statement, and we talk about this often, but it's very important with analysis. What are you talking about? What argument are you trying to make? You have to gather the evidence that informs your arguments. It drives the organization of your paragraphs. So when I collect my evidence, you want to think that each bit of evidence may be a paragraph or a couple paragraphs. It just kind of, so everything makes sense. Evidence has to be properly vetted. It has to be appropriate. It is both for the sake of credibility and ensure that the paper flows well. And then focus on paragraph coherence is essential. So you're trying to explain something to somebody or to make an argument about something. The argument has to be logical. So we are imparting our logic to the reader. And the last thing, and I like to talk about revision, so I will talk about revision one more time. Some things you want to think about after your paper is written, or even while you're writing your paper. Does my paper have an obvious thesis statement? Do I understand the purpose of my paper? Will the reader obviously understand it? Has my subject been adequately analyzed? Have I done the work that I need to do to really make a compelling argument? Is the paper clear? Is it backed by evidence? Can I defend my argument? It's also a good idea sometimes to understand counter arguments so you can make an adequate defense. Do I draw conclusions that are compelling? All these things are things to think about when you go to do your revision of your paper to make sure that everything lines up in a way that you want it to. If all these criteria are met, you will have a paper that connects with the reader in a logical way, and it will be a good one.